Welcome to Lifespring Church. We hope you enjoy this message. To find out more about Lifespring Church, head to linktr.ee/Lifespring UK.
So I'll tell you a funny story. So if you go back in time, and I mean a really long time, like 25 or even 30 years, I used to be the church treasurer. And every now and then, Neville would want to talk on money and giving. So I'd say, Chris, come and do your talk on money and giving. So every now and then I would do that, and then I'd go back to doing the bookkeeping. So I was really excited. Several weeks ago, I got an email from Neville to say, Chris, can you come and speak on Sunday? I said, yeah, I'd love to. He said, here's the passage. And I looked it up, and it's like, oh my gosh, it's about money and giving. So, okay. No, anyway, no, I'm happy to get back to that topic. I've been listening to a lot of the talks on Abraham and really enjoying them. And I was here the week that John kicked it off. And, John did a great job that week. And as I was going home after that week, I was thinking about Abraham. And I was just thinking, like, if someone asked me about Abraham, like what would I say? Like, how do you describe him? Like, what was going on in his head when he did all that great stuff for God? And I had all these thoughts going through my head. So when I got the email from Neville asking me to speak, it's like, yeah, there's the passage from Genesis 14 that we'll get to in a minute. But unfortunately, you've got to put up with my kind of random, rambling thoughts about Abraham before we get into that, because I think it helps understand the context of like what was going through his head when he did all that stuff. So I want to talk a bit about that first before we get into the passage. So Abraham is rightly called a hero of the faith. The New Testament book of Hebrews in chapter 11 has this great hall of fame of all of these heroes of the faith through biblical history. And of course, Abraham is quite rightly in there. Also in Hebrews chapter 6, we're told to imitate those people. So it says we should imitate those people who, through faith and patience, inherit what was promised. So of course, Abraham is one of those. We're told to imitate him. But when you think about someone that you want to imitate, I find it can be a little bit intimidating sometimes, because we kind of hold them up to be this big hero, this kind of perfect figure that we've got to try and copy. And whether it be a biblical hero or a hero from some other walk of life, maybe a celebrity, a sports personality, an entrepreneur, a social justice campaigner, maybe a political leader from the past. Well, I guess if it's a political leader, it would have to be from the past, wouldn't it? Because not so many heroes now, but we won't go there. But we have these people, and we kind of put them on a pedestal. And sometimes I think we can put Abraham, like, on a pedestal. And I find that a little bit, like, hard to imitate, because it's like, well, that's, like, not me. They kind of give the impression of having it all together, being, like, supremely confident. And I would love to have a conversation with some famous hero and say, well, like, what's it like when you don't know what to do? Like, what's it like when you feel vulnerable or like you're lost? But rarely does anyone ever admit to that. And in thinking about heroes and great leaders, I was trying to find someone who was actually a bit more honest about not knowing what to do. And the one I stumbled across is George Washington. If you could put the first slide up, we've got a picture of George Washington there. So George Washington, of course, was the first president of the United States, and he led the Americas against the British colonizers. There's a famous painting of him in the White House, and that's the painting there on the screen. And this painting was from 1776, when he was leading the Continental Army against the colonizers. And he was crossing the Delaware River. And of course, they crossed, and they won a great victory, and they returned. And it was a really big event in that war. And I find this picture like really interesting, because here he is crossing this ice-cold river, and he looks immaculate. Look at him, just like the image of confidence, immaculately dressed, not a hair out of place, just supremely confident. And I think that's the kind of image that we project on our heroes. Sometimes we project Abraham being like that. It's like, yeah, he knew exactly what to do. But George Washington, interestingly, was remarkably honest about his vulnerabilities. He was someone who admitted his failures. He was someone who would listen to the advice of others. He took responsibility for his mistakes. And one time in 1775, he was asked to lead the Continental Army, and he said no. He said, I'm not up to that. And it's just refreshingly honest that someone who we project as a hero is actually open about their vulnerabilities. And I feel a bit like that with Abraham. If we put the next slide up from Romans 4, this is how Paul talked about Abraham. Abraham, against all hope, Abraham in hope believed, and so he became the father of many nations. Yet he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but he was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God. And sometimes I read that and it's like really encouraging. It's like, yeah, I want to be there. But other times I read it and think, well, yeah, but I'm not there. Like, Abraham never wavered. But sometimes I think, well, I waver. So how do I relate to that? Like, Abraham's, he's this kind of perfect man of faith who never wavered. He believed against circumstances. But I waver. So how do you square that? And there are two things about Abraham I want to call out to try and understand, what he was like before we get into the passage, which I promise we will get to eventually. There are two things. The first thing is, what do we mean by faith or belief? Abraham believed God and he never wavered. What do we mean by that? Is it some kind of 100% certainty that I'm going to just go for it against all the evidence and I'm confident like George Washington, or not? Because I struggle sometimes. I was reminded of a debate I heard a long time ago on Premier Christian Radio about faith, belief. And it was a debate, it was 8 years ago now, by two people. Number one, Peter Boghossian, who's a kind of leading atheist thinker. And on the other hand, it was a guy called Tim McGrew, who's a Christian philosopher, professor of epistemology, which means knowledge. So these two guys are debating about faith. And Peter Boghossian, the atheist, his argument was this. It's like, you Christians, you believe in something you can't see. You believe in something that has no evidence. You believe in something that has no substance. You are insane. That was the basis of his argument. But Tim McGrew, I thought, countered with a fantastic argument. And I would say Tim McGrew won the debate because he said, no. He said, that's not what the Bible means by faith. He said a better way to think about faith and belief is trust. And trust is a much better way to think about it because it's trust in something or someone. It's trust in something that does have evidence. It does have substance. And it is something that is entirely supportable and logical. It's not this kind of blind leap. It's a trust in something that there is evidence for and has substance. And I found that really helpful because it's like, well, I can do that. I might not be able to make this leap of 100% certainty, but I can trust. Because it's like, what are you trusting in? And, if you look at what the definition of trust means, it's about trusting in something that you have confidence in. So it's about trusting in God's character. It's about trusting in God's power. And I like that because it puts the emphasis more on God than on us. So it's not so much about, I can make this leap. It's about, I can make a small step, and I can trust this God who I believe in and know and trust in. So I found that just a really helpful way to think about it. And if you could put the next slide up, also in Romans 4, Paul says this. He says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. That's that same thing, right? He believed. But I love the way that it's translated in the Message because it says he trusted God. He trusted God to set him right. And I just find that something that I can relate to. So I can imitate that. That's something that I can follow. So that's the first thing about Abraham's character and where he was at, is thinking about it as trusting God. The second thing I want to say about Abraham before we get into the passage is that he made some mistakes. And when I say he made mistakes, I mean really, really big ones. I mean, he really screwed up. Just a couple of examples, and there's many more. So, you'd be familiar, God promised him a son, he was 90 years old, his wife was 19, he's like, nothing's happening, and so he goes to have a child with someone else. It's like, no, Abraham, that's not what God meant. It's like, you screwed up. Like you really screwed up. Then again, in Genesis 12, there was a famine. He goes down to Egypt, where there was food available. His wife's very beautiful. He's worried that they find out he's her husband. They're going to kill him and take his wife. So he lies. So no, tell him you're my sister. So he was afraid. Right? He was afraid and he lied. He really screwed up. So we have this image of heroes like George Washington, like these great biblical heroes. And sometimes you might think, I can't do that. I've messed up. I've really, really messed up my life many times. Maybe that's how we think. Well, that doesn't disqualify you, because you're in good company, because Abraham screwed up. And if you could put that verse up again for Romans 4, that version from the Message, he trusted God to set him right. So when I think about being called to imitate Abraham, it doesn't mean go and lie. It doesn't mean go and do the other stuff he does. But what it means is this: despite your mistakes, trust God to make things right. And that's something I feel that I can imitate. So just a bit about where I think Abraham was at as we get into this passage. I think it's just helpful to set the context of what was he like, what was he thinking. He had all these kind of weird promises. So that's where I think he was at. He trusted God and he didn't let his mistakes hinder him. So let's get into the passage, Genesis 14. So just give you a bit of context on this passage. This is in the ancient Near East. Abraham was a kind of a nomad. He had his extended family with him. He had all his cattle and looking for somewhere to settle, wandering around. And he had his nephew Lot with him. John talked about Lot quite a bit last week. Lot and his family got kidnapped. So Abraham goes out to rescue him. And they have this battle. Remember, at that time, there was not established nations with firm national borders, with police forces and armies. It wasn't like that. It was basically a bunch of regional kings, regional rulers. So Abraham went out against some of these regional kings, and he won. And in winning this battle against this alliance of kings, he would have become quite a strong political figure in that region. It's like, oh, you just beat that regional alliance of kings, and now you're the man. And that's how we get into Genesis 14. So I'm going to read the first section of this. Genesis 14, verse 17 to 20. It says, after Abraham returned from defeating Kedorlaomer and the kings allied with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out some bread and some wine. He was a priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abraham, saying, blessed be Abraham by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And praise be to God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. So Abraham's come back from this battle. He's defeated the kind of regional alliance of kings, feeling quite pleased with himself probably, quite a powerful figure now. And out appears this dude called Melchizedek. Appears from nowhere, who is apparently a priest of the Most High. It's kind of a little bit weird. It's like, what's a priest of the Most High doing there and appearing from nowhere? I don't have time today to talk about who this guy was. And anyway, I'm not sure I know the answer. But he appeared representing God, and Abraham gave him a tenth of everything that he had just gained. So this is the first time in the Bible that this practice of giving away some of your money or possessions to God effectively is the first time that is mentioned in the Bible. And in a few minutes we'll get more into what that means, but before I talk about what that means, I want to just think about what did Abraham do here and why did he do it? So I call this passage A Tale of Two Kings, and I've read that passage quite a few times over the years, but in all honesty, I'd never realized the second part of the chapter. So if you go on now to Genesis 14, the next section of this chapter, Melchizedek has appeared, Abraham gave him a tenth of everything, and then the king of Sodom says to Abraham, "Give me the people and keep the goods for yourself." But Abraham said to the king of Sodom, with a raised hand, "I have sworn an oath to the Lord, the God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or the strap of a sandal, so that you will never be able to say, 'I made Abraham rich.' I will accept nothing but what my men have eaten and the share that belongs to the men who are with me." So I call this a tale of two kings, because you got on the one hand Melchizedek, king of Salem, which means Jerusalem, so let's call him the king of Jerusalem on one hand, you got the king of Sodom on the other. And Abraham has a choice. It's like, who's he going to go with? Because the king of Sodom would have been quite an influential local power broker. Abraham was quite a powerful man now because he'd won this battle. So the king of Sodom is offering him really a treaty. He probably would have set Abraham up to be a local powerful figure in that region. Very tempting. But Abraham has a choice to go with that offer of a treaty with the king of Sodom and be a local power leader, or honor God by giving a tenth to Melchizedek. And he chooses to go with Melchizedek, the reason being, he does not want to be in debt to anyone. He does not want to be in debt to the king of Sodom, because he could have been set up as a local power king of the region, but he was always be indebted to the king of Sodom. And he didn't want that. He's like, no, I am going to trust God. And that really was what Abraham was doing here. He's making a statement saying, I'm going to trust God to fulfill his promises, to protect me, to provide for me. I don't want to be indebted to this other king. And it reminds me of a passage in the Psalms, Psalm 75, verse 6, says this, it says, "No one can exalt themselves. It is God who brings one up, it's God who brings another down." And Abraham was trusting God to exalt him. He didn't want to trust in the king of Sodom. He didn't want to trust in himself. So for me, that's really the heart of what Abraham was doing here in giving a tenth. He's saying, I'm going to trust God. I'm not going to trust in the powers around me. So that's what Abraham did in this chapter. And then as we go on through the Old Testament, you see this practice continue. It's called tithing, giving a tenth. So you see when Moses brings in the Old Testament law, it becomes a requirement. It's a requirement to give a tenth of your harvest and your herds and everything to God. So I just want to look at how that develops through the Old Testament and then try and think, well, how does that apply to us? Like, is it relevant to us? Is it a rule for us? Like, what does it mean? But as you look at the Old Testament law, there are three things that this giving was for. So giving a tenth, we'll call it the tithe. There were three things that it was for. Firstly, it was to celebrate what God has done and to acknowledge him as the source of all we have. In other words, I'm going to trust you, God. That was the first thing it was for. The second thing it was for was supporting the Levites. The Levites were the ministers, if you like, of their kind of ceremonies and the religious practices. So it was to support them because they didn't have land, they couldn't grow crops, so they needed to eat. So that's the second thing it was for, was to support the Levites and the priests. And the third thing it was for was looking after the poor, looking after the widow, looking after the orphans, and looking after the foreigner or the refugee. It was for those three things. And let's just have a look at how that is explained in Deuteronomy 14. So the tithe was done at different festivals. And there were festivals through the season where they would have to bring their tithe. And this passage in Deuteronomy describes what would happen at one of those festivals when people were bringing in the offering. So Deuteronomy 14 says this. It says, "Make an offering of 10%, a tithe of all the produce which grows in your fields year after year. Bring this into the presence of God, your God, at the place he designates for worship, and eat there the tithe from your grain, wine, oil, and the firstborn from your herds and flocks. In this way, you will learn to live in deep reverence for God." And that's a really nice verse for me. It's about learning to live in reverence for God because he is the source of all we have. But as you do that, use the money to buy anything you want: cattle, sheep, wine, or beer. Huh? Honest? Anything that looks good to you, you and your family can then feast in the presence of the God, your God, and have a good time. It's about celebration. Right? It's about celebrating. And that, remember, the celebrating is trust, because it's saying, God, I acknowledge you as the source of all I have. I had to check that translation. That's from the Message. It's like, I looked up that word for beer, and the Hebrew word actually means intensely alcoholic liquor. So I think Eugene Peterson did okay in making that beer. So you're having a celebration, but then it goes on, right? At the end of every third year, gather the tithe. If we could have that verse back up. If you gather your tithe from all your produce of that year, put it aside in storage. Keep it in reserve for the Levite, because they won't get any property or inheritance as you will. And keep it for the foreigner and the orphan and the widow who live in your neighborhood. That way they will have plenty to eat, and God, your God, will bless you. So, celebration and trust, supporting the Levites, looking after the vulnerable, the weak, the poor, the widow, the orphan, refugee. That's what it was for. That basically carries on through the whole of the Old Testament. I like one of the festivals. So there are these different festivals, and there's different verses that describe what's going on. In Deuteronomy 26, I'm just going to paraphrase this. I won't read it all. But to me, this captures the heart of giving. Right? It really captures why we do it. So this is talking again about one of the festivals, I guess after they've had their beer. It says, go to the priest and say, I announce to God that I have entered this land, but I used to be a wandering Aramean. My father went down to Egypt. He sojourned there just with a handful of brothers. They became a great nation, but the Egyptians abused and battered us in cruel and savage slavery. But we cried out to the Lord, and God took us out of Egypt with a strong hand, with signs, wonders, and miracles. He brought us to this place, and he gave us this land flowing with milk and honey. So here I am. I brought the first fruits of what I've grown on this ground that you gave me, and I place it in the presence of God. And then I prostrate myself before God and rejoice. Celebrate all the good things that God has given you. And that's really the heart of what Abraham did in Genesis 14. It's the heart of what the tithe was for in the Old Testament. And I think it's the spirit of what we should carry forward with us. It's saying, God, I was nothing. I screwed up. You rescued me. You've brought me to a better place. And everything I have is from you, God, whether it's a lot or a little. God, what I have, I'm going to give back to you and honor you, because I know all the good I have is from you. And that, for me, is the heart of what the tithe was for in the Old Testament. So they carried on with this tradition, but of course that's the Old Testament. So how should we think about that today? If you think about an Old Testament practice, is it relevant to us? That's a big question, and I can't really haven't got the time to really go into that. But if you think about the Old Testament law, there were different aspects to it. There was the moral law, the ceremonial law, the civil law. What's relevant to us today, what's not, that's a big question. I mean, you could say things like, well, hey, the Ten Commandments, they're good. That's good today. But other parts of the law, clearly are not. I mean, no one's going to get stoned if they go to work today. So how do you think about what is relevant from the Old Testament law? And just in thinking about that, there's two authors that I really like the way they captured it. One is Michael Bird, the other one's Brian Rosner. I'm just going to read really a paraphrase quote from some of their work that talks about how to think about applying the Old Testament law in our lives today. Is it a rule? Is some of it relevant? Is none of it relevant? Etc. So Michael Bird said this, and I paraphrase. He said, "It was never the intent that the Old Testament law would be a set of rules that would last forever. They were not divine commands that would be obeyed always. It was a temporary administration of God's grace until the Messiah came. It taught Israel about God's holiness. It taught about sin. It taught them how to worship God in a pagan environment. It was part of the scaffolding that was keeping things temporarily in order until the Messiah came. So Michael Burr goes on to say that the Old Testament law is not the basis for Christian ethics. The basis for Christian ethics is the life of Jesus. It's the example of Jesus and life in the Spirit. But he goes on to say the law remains relevant in many ways, but more of a consultant for ethics rather than a code of ethics. So that's how I would think about this practice of giving your money. It's not like a strict code, but I think if you think of the Old Testament law in this respect as being a consultant for our ethical standards, then I think it works. And Brian Rosner goes on to build on that, and he goes on to say, he talks about how Paul talks about the law. He said Paul does not talk about the law as a set of commands, but he explains it as wisdom for living. And Paul uses that to make reflective guidance, expansive application. So it's a bit the same thing. It's like it's wisdom for living. So if I think about what we've looked at on the tithe, you see what it's for in the Old Testament. Celebrate God, express our trust in Him, support the priests or the ministries, so the people who work in the church, and to support those in need, whether it be the orphan, the widow, the refugee, whatever. And all of that is in the New Testament. Paul talks about supporting those who preach the gospel. Paul talks about giving to those in need. So I think all of those things that the tithe was for are relevant to us today in the spirit of what it was meant, not necessarily the kind of strict law of what it was meant. So just to wrap up, I just want to finish up with a quote from John Calvin. And you can apply this not just to money, because it's really relevant to anything. Like, money can become an idol in our heart, but it's the same with anything, whether it be, your job, your status, your home, et cetera, et cetera. All those things can become an idol. And remember, as I was reading Michael Bird there, he said one of the purposes of the Old Testament was to teach the people of God how to live and worship God when they're surrounded by people worshiping other idols. And I think, to me, that's really wise. It's like, we are surrounded by people worshiping other idols, so it's teaching us how to not have those idols in our lives, but worship God. So this quote from John Calvin, he said, where riches hold... Can you put the slide up? Just there's the last one. Where riches hold the dominion of the heart, God has lost his authority. And I think that, for me, is a good way to think about money, giving, but not just money, like anything in our lives that has become an idol. If it holds dominion in your heart, God has lost his authority in your life. So tithing to me is about releasing. Like, release that money to God, release whatever idols we have in our heart to God, and let God have his authority in our lives. So just to wrap up, if you think about Abraham, think about what was going through his mind as he kind of made all those mistakes, screwed up. Think about what it means to imitate someone. It doesn't mean you've got that 100% certainty kind of mental leap into the unknown. It's about trusting God to make things right. And I can trust because it's just a small step. It's just a little step. So Abraham did that, and of course God fulfilled everything through him. So that's kind of how I think about this passage. Just to close, I was reading the other day Psalm 108. It says, "My heart, O God, is steadfast." And immediately I thought the same thing. It's like, Abraham, he never wavered, never wavered, never wavered. And it does mean my heart is steadfast, but as I looked at the different translations and the Hebrew word behind it, it also means ready. So my heart, I want it to be steadfast, Lord, but it might not be, but Lord, I'm ready. And that is about trust. It's like, I'm ready, Lord, to trust you. So I just thought that was a nice way to kind of wrap this up. It's like, Lord, I want my heart to be steadfast, but if it's not, Lord, at least I'm ready because I know I can trust you, because I know, Lord, that you are good. So that's my view on Abraham and Genesis 14. I hope you found that helpful, and I'll just quickly pray as we wrap up. So, Lord, I pray that you would just help us to learn from Abraham, Lord, that the way he trusted you. Lord, he trusted you to make things right. And Lord, however we're feeling, Lord, however we might feel about the mistakes we've made, or that we're not qualified, Lord, we're not perfect, Lord, it really doesn't matter, because we know that you are good. And we're confident in you, Lord, and we know that we can trust you. And I just pray, Lord, that you would help all of us to trust you with our finances, Lord, and just to release things to you, Lord, so that there's no idols in our heart, and you, Lord, have authority in our heart. We invite you, Lord, just to have that authority in our hearts. In Jesus' name. Amen.
Thanks for watching this message. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. To find out more about our church, head to linktr.ee/LifespringUK.